voted to leave the European Union.
The United Kingdom will leave the European Union.
Hello and welcome to the special edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. It's the beginning of the end of the European Union as we've known it. In an unprecedented move, the UK has triggered Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty, making its request to leave the EU official. The clock is now counting down on 2 years for both sides to strike a deal on how the UK actually exits the Union and how they'll define their relationship once they've done so. If negotiations fail, the UK will be kicked out with nothing. Some Britons hoped it would never come to this, that Parliament would intervene to stop them leaving such a large alliance. But the time for those debates is done. Now the question is how the UK and the EU will forge new ties. At stake is business, borders, and Britons living in the bloc. Prime Minister Theresa May says it's a unique opportunity to build a better Britain, with the UK back in charge of its own laws and decisions. For the EU, it's now about damage control. How will Brussels ensure the deal doesn't encourage other members to rush for the exit? Today's Newsmaker is Article 50, as we ask what its triggering means for the future of the UK and an EU trying to keep itself from falling apart.
This is an historic moment from which there can be no turning back. Britain is leaving the European Union.
The argument to leave was passionate, divisive, and at times outlandish.
At the moment, we have no control over our borders.
And we will lose more control.
For the Leave camp, its narrow referendum victory was a vindication. For Europe and nearly half of UK voters, it was a cause of disbelief, with protests and calls for another vote. But after David Cameron fell on his sword,
I think the country requires fresh leadership to take it in this direction.
The new British Prime Minister Theresa May made the government's position clear.
Brexit means Brexit.
And the UK has now officially begun its Brexit from the European Union. Article 50 is a bit like a set of divorce papers. Triggering it starts the 2-year countdown to negotiate the UK's separation from the EU. European Council President Donald Tusk has said he will present draft Brexit guidelines to EU member states by Friday. One of the key issues will be working out the rights of UK citizens living in the EU and vice versa. And the UK will likely look to make a trade deal with the EU. The negotiations will take place between all EU members, and each will have the ability to veto conditions. There's concern the EU will take a tough stance to stop other dissatisfied members looking to stray. Even if they don't have a final agreement by April 2019, the UK will still have to leave, unless there's a unanimous agreement to wind back the clock. But Theresa May has said she's prepared to walk away if she doesn't get what she wants, saying that no deal for Britain is better than a bad deal for Britain.
There's no reason to pretend that this is a happy day, neither in Brussels nor in London.
Following the referendum, the EU asked the UK to make its exit swift and made it clear Britain wouldn't be getting any special treatment. But no member has ever triggered Article 50 before, so exit negotiations are uncharted territory, as is the impact someone leaving will have. And there's concern Brexit will threaten the EU's very existence. The UK is the bloc's second biggest economy, and there are fears there'll be a chain reaction of referendums to leave that could see the EU unravel.
We already miss you. Thank you and goodbye.
Now that the UK is officially on its way, does the EU need to urgently look at ways to reform? And what does this all mean for the UK on its own and the EU together? Yvette McCullough, The Newsmakers.
To look at what's at stake, we're joined now by our guests from across the UK. In London, we have Robert Oulds. He's a Conservative councillor and the director of the Bruges Group, a pro-Brexit think tank. In southeastern England, in Canterbury, Richard Whitman, he's a politics professor at the University of Kent, and he heads up the Global Europe Centre, which looks at the EU's evolving relationship with the UK. And in Edinburgh, James Dorman, a member of Scotland's Parliament from the Scottish National Party, which strongly opposed Brexit. We'll have the view from Brussels later in the programme. Thanks so much, all of you, for joining us. Robert, let me begin with you. There's this talk of now being the moment for Britons to come together, for Prime Minister Theresa May to unite the country. But the reality is the country is deeply divided. This has been one of the most contentious issues in decades. How does it happen? How do you actually bring this country together when it's so deeply divided?
Well, first of all, it needs to be stated that according to the opinion polls, 2/3 of British people want Brexit to be got on with and delivered. So the country is mostly united behind Brexit. In Britain, having 66%, in some polls as much as 68%, wanting the government to get on and deliver Brexit is the biggest majority you can have for any political issue. The country is quite clearly united on Brexit.
Is the country...
That is a fact. Even in Scotland...
Okay, let me ask James Dornan then.
Even in Scotland...
Okay, you say even in Scotland. James Dornan, is the country united behind Brexit and they want to get on with it?
If 62 to 38 means that the country's united, then it's a form of unity that I don't recognise. The clear fact is that Scotland overwhelmingly voted to leave to remain in the European Union, and the wishes of the people of Scotland have been completely discarded by Theresa May. I nearly said Maggie Thatcher there, but it's an easy mistake to make. Theresa May and her gung-ho attitude. For a Remainer who wants to prove herself to be an extreme leaver, her gung-ho attitude to the people of Scotland and making sure that the UK leaves Brexit no matter what the cost.
Richard Whitman, let me throw to you what the President of the European Council, Donald Tusk, said. He said there's no reason to pretend that this is a happy day, neither in Brussels nor in London. And he also said, you know, Britain, we already miss you, thank you and goodbye. What did you make of what he said?
Well, it's not thank you and goodbye yet, of course, because we're about to embark on this 2-year process of negotiating exit from the European Union. So the UK is going to be around for a while yet within the EU. But I think what was interesting was the fact that he sort of started off with a sort of regretful sentiment, because a lot of what we've heard so far from Brussels has suggested that the EU wants to play hardball, but even suggestions that the UK should be in some way punished for seeking to exit the EU. And I think what we're now at is a moment where there's a kind of recalibration, a sort of stepping back perhaps from some of the public statements, because we're now about to embark on what's going to be a lengthy, detailed and an incredibly complicated process of pulling apart the relationship between the UK and the EU.
Mm-hmm. Robert, if the EU does want to play hardball, and it might want to, they have every right to, right? You can't ask for a divorce and then still want all the rights that you had in the marriage.
Well, there's other agreements that sit above the European Union. To think that trade would cease when Britain leaves the European Union between Britain and what remains of the EU is just completely false. There are international agreements. There's the WTO technical agreement dealing with technical barriers to trade. Basically, trade will continue. We'll still continue to cooperate with the European Union, but we'll do so as an independent country. Most countries in the world trade with the European Union, but they do so on terms either that they've negotiated themselves without having the enormous cost of the European Union in terms of its financial cost and the regulatory cost, but they'll do so either on special terms that they've negotiated or on world terms. And countries like China, the United States, they sell more.
Robert, sorry to interrupt you. Let me ask you this question
than Britain does.
So let me ask this from a different direction. Let me ask it in another way, from a different direction. From the European perspective, if they give Britain a good deal, that means that you can break away and get a great deal. That means anyone can break away and get a great deal. It means there's no more Europe. They'd be absolutely suicidal to do so. Do you accept that they're going to play hardball as a result of that? Because you can't just leave and expect to have all the rights that you had beforehand, or maybe even more, and there's nothing then to gain from the EU's perspective.
The worst deal is being a member of the European Union, and countries are finding out that through their membership of the EU, the enormous costs that places, particularly membership of the euro, the single currency, that they are going to have to leave. Countries like Italy, Greece, eventually they'll have to leave the EU setup because they are just failing inside the European Union. It is destroying jobs. So they can perhaps try and think about putting some restrictive measures on Britain. They'll soon find out that they can't do so legally because the EU is bound by its own rules to have its markets open to neighbouring countries. Its own regulations regarding financial services would give Britain access to their markets because we have equivalence already. And WTO rules means you can't keep someone out if you have international standards.
You've mentioned a
Britain
bunch
already
of...
follows international standards.
Sure.
The European Union does not have the power to undermine us, and they don't have the ability either
maybe
because
they don't
are
want to
lurching from one crisis to another.
Sure, but maybe they don't want to undermine you. Maybe they just want to get the best deal for themselves, is what I'm trying to get at. James, 8 months on, have you been convinced in any way, shape or form that this hasn't been the economic apocalypse that some people had feared, and that maybe Brexit might be a decent thing and a stable thing for the economy?
Not in the slightest. I listened to Robert there, and it's a land of hope and glory speech. The reality is that the Fraser of Allender Institute says that the Brexit would cost 80,000 Scottish jobs and £2,000 per head of the population. And that is a bit of a price to pay for an internal Conservative battle, which is, at the end of the day, that's what this was all about. And there has been nothing.
Separation from the rest of the UK will cost jobs in Scotland.
Because there has been absolutely no information from the Westminster government to tell us what sort of Brexit they're going to get. How could we possibly then make a decision that this Brexit is going to be good for us if we don't know what the UK government are looking for or what the EU is likely to give? And let's be honest here, the EU will maybe not play hardball, but they will be firm with the UK for two reasons. One is because they have to look after their own members, and the other is they also have to send out that message.
Okay, Richard Whitman, given the privilege of hindsight, given that Article 50 has been triggered many months on after the actual vote, and given all the available indications that we have from the Prime Minister and others, are you optimistic or pessimistic about the economy in the UK now that it's going to break away?
Well, I think we haven't yet really seen the effects of Brexit because, you know, the fundamental terms of trade between the UK and the EU are unaltered. Perhaps the only question is business confidence and the extent to which business confidence has picked up since the vote, and that's true. But of course, the UK is also at the moment lumbering under an exchange rate issue. Its exchange rate for the dollar, the pound having weakened against the dollar and also weakened against the euro, which is a double-edged sword because it's been good for some exporters, but it's also leading to rising inflation.
Pound is up today.
Yeah, but I mean, the pound has ticked up a little bit. It's nowhere back to where it was before we had the vote in June. But I mean, that's, you know, the pound has beneficial effects for some sectors of the economy, but it doesn't have beneficial effects overall. And if there is a benefit for the UK from where the pound is at the moment, that we're going to see somewhat down the road because, of course, exporters have to adjust and so on. But I think the real question for most businesses is going to be certainty, and to have a sense that the UK, even as it's leaving the European Union, is moving into a relationship with the EU, which is clear quite a way ahead of time. I mean, what we don't want to do is to be 18 months, 2 years down the road, and we still have uncertainty as to exactly what the form of economic relationship or trading relationship is going to be between the UK.
Robert, and as Richard said, real question is uncertainty. Lots of uncertainty for people who are working in the UK, people who want to go to the UK, British citizens who are currently on the European mainland and so on. Immigration was a major issue for Brexit voters. They wanted their country to be tough on immigration. Is that how it's going to play out, or are we going to see something much softer than what was expected during the build-up to the vote?
Just like to come back to the previous point about Britain getting a bad deal from the EU to keep other nations in the European Union. What does it say about the European Union if they have to give a deal to Britain that would actually damage their own interests to keep other nations locked inside the European Union? Clearly, There's nothing good about the European Union. That's why in the referendum campaign, all we heard was scare stories about how the world would come to an end if we voted to exit the European Union.
Sure, but we also
become an
heard that 75 million Turks would be invading Britain. We also heard that 350 million pounds every week would be going to the NHS. So everybody had scare stories. I don't want to kind of revisit all of these now. Immigration. Is this government going to be tough on immigration, Robert?
This government will, I'm sure, guarantee the EU citizens within the UK their existing rights. My understanding, and something that I've wrote about at length, is that actually British citizens living on the continent, European Union citizens living within the UK have their rights protected. That's a matter under international law. They've executed those rights. They've acquired these rights. Their status will not change. They'll have the same rights. So basically, Britain will be open to the existing people that have come here to live, to work, just like other Britons have gone to the continent. Their rights will be protected. So that is something that I am very confident will happen. The reason why this hasn't been agreed as yet is because the German Chancellor, Angela Merkel, said no. When Theresa May said, let's just wrap this one issue up now, let's give equal rights for people who reside in
and there's going to be 2 years of negotiations.
Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, rejected it.
Okay, this is where I thank you, Robert and Richard. And James, stay where you are. I know you're champing at the bit to talk about Scotland. We'll turn our attention now to Scotland, where the Parliament has backed calls for a second referendum on independence. Will Westminster let it happen? And how will Scots vote this time around? Here's Natalie Perhernan with this report.
Each year, Scotland celebrates its Viking heritage. They were a proud and fierce people, and those traits can still be seen in the Scottish people and their nation's fight for independence. They're now on the verge of a new political battle which could reshape the Scottish identity. Scotland voted 62 to 38% to remain in the EU in last year's Brexit vote. Now a referendum of a different kind could be back on the table in Edinburgh. It would give Scots the choice of breaking away from the UK and staying in the EU. A 2014 referendum on independence was 10% shy of making Scotland a sovereign state. The Scottish Parliament has reopened the door for another independence vote to take place by early 2019.
Scotland's future should be in Scotland's hands.
But the British government will have to give the final approval for any referendum. And with Brexit negotiations underway, it's not the top priority.
Now is the time when we should be pulling together, not hanging apart, pulling together to ensure we get the best possible deal for the whole of the UK, including the people of Scotland.
If the referendum does go ahead and Scotland chooses independence, these are just 3 of the crucial roadblocks. The country is home to one of the UK Navy's 3 main operating bases and its fleet of Trident nuclear submarines. It's controversial, but it's also a big employer. Then there's the issue of whether Scotland would be able to hold on to all of the wealth from the remaining offshore oil reserves and the revenue it could generate from Scottish waters. And finally, the question about whether an independent Scotland would actually be able to become a part of the European single market, because right now there are no guarantees from the EU that it would. But will the reality of Brexit be enough of a catalyst to divide the United Kingdom? Natalie Perhernan, The Newsmakers.
To discuss this, let's bring back in SNP parliamentarian James Dornan and from the EU's capital, Brussels, David Coburn. He's a Scottish member of the European Parliament and the leader of UKIP in Scotland, which is happy about Brexit but opposed to Scottish independence. We've got about 5.5 minutes with 2 Scots who disagree with each other over this. Let's start with David. David, I'm assuming you feel that Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP are just annoying you, trolling you, and are being opportunistic. Are they being opportunistic here?
They're being opportunistic and they're destroying Scottish jobs and destroying the Scottish economy. The Scots voted overwhelmingly to remain part of the United Kingdom, and they didn't vote very enthusiastically for the European Union. 40% disagreed with being in the European Union. More Scots voted to remain in the UK than to remain in the EU. So quite frankly, Scotland is not interested in this. Sturgeon lost her majority in the Parliament. She has no mandate to have a referendum. We were told it was once in a lifetime. I fought with her over this last referendum, and I'll be fighting in the next one. She has one, but quite frankly, she has no right to do so. It is for Westminster to decide that, for Scottish members of Parliament in Westminster, English members of Parliament in Westminster, Welsh and Irish members of Parliament in Westminster to make that decision, not the Scottish Parliament. She's out with her remit. And quite frankly, so all she's doing is destroying jobs.
We know where you
she
stand.
has no ability to get into the European Union.
Let's get James to
it
respond.
was impossible.
Sure. James, you're destroying Scottish jobs. That ship has sailed. You had a vote in 2014. You lost. Move on and get with the times.
We had a vote in 2014. We then had a general election in 2015 where 56 out of 59 Scottish MPs were from the Scottish National Party, which makes independence its core belief. We then had a Scottish election in 2016 where 47% of the people voted for the SNP, knowing fine well that if we were dragged out of the European Union against the will of the people of Scotland, despite the ludicrous comments that David Coburn just made about 45% being a minuscule number, but the 40% that voted no in the European referendum being really, really important. It's just absolute nonsense. The people of Scotland have made it clear that they support the SNP. They've made it clear that they understand what the SNP said in their manifesto, and we have got the right and the mandate to ask for this referendum. And all this talk about David Coburn talking about Westminster, Westminster must say, Westminster must say.
This is interesting. Yes,
makes our.
That's interesting. Let's ask David. Let me pose that to David. David, the same way the pro-Brexit people in the UK spoke about Brussels being out of touch, not listening to people. This is how these guys see London and Westminster. They're saying they're out of touch. Why should they make the decisions for us? We want to decide for ourselves. It's a similar philosophy, isn't it, David?
No, they didn't. They voted to remain part of the UK. How he can come up with that is absolute twaddle. We did not vote to separate from the rest of the United Kingdom. It's absolute nonsense.
Why don't you put it to the test, David?
Havers, laddie.
We also didn't vote to be in the EU. We didn't vote to leave the EU.
Yes, and, but 40% of us didn't vote for it. 40% were against
David, let me ask you.
That is a sizable
James,
number.
James, if you give me a second.
Of us voted to leave the
James,
UK.
give me a second, please. David, why don't you put it to the test? If you're that confident,
10% less than half.
David, if you're that confident, why aren't you willing to put it to the test next year or the year after? Have another vote. If they lose, then surely it's done and dusted. They're dead and buried, and they won't have another vote in their lifetimes.
Because Scotland needs jobs. All this economic uncertainty will destroy industry in Scotland, jobs in Scotland. Scots need jobs. The Scottish nationalists have got a 15 billion deficit, and it is destroying Scotland. If we were to go into the European Union with a $15 billion deficit created by the SNP, we would be treated like Greece. The First Minister goes on about, having to cut back on this, cut back on the rest of it. There would be absolute mayhem in Scotland. The European Union would have to take over the country as they did in Greece, and you'd have massive recession. You'd have people getting their jobs lost. You would have cuts all over the place. It's absolute nonsense. It would be austerity max. She's always banging on about austerity. She'd have austerity max. She has no understanding of economics. It's Sturgeonomics, which is made out of pure ground.
Let's get James's response. James, you guys don't understand economics. It's Sturgeonomics. You're playing with the economy. When you should be focusing on jobs, you're playing with the economy by calling for another referendum. What's your response?
That's right. I mean, David keeps on talking about people havering, and then he comes out with a contribution like that. What he doesn't mention is that this 15 billion deficit that people keep on talking about, it's not a deficit that has grown under the SNP
deficit.
It's a deficit that has, if it exists, it's a deficit that has grown under the Union. It's not Scotland. It's not Scottish government.
Well, no, it was 7 billion actually before, and you got up to 15 billion actually.
And the UK owns...
At the time of the referendum, it was 7 billion.
David, give him a
15 billion.
David, give him a chance. Let him make his
Behave
point.
yourself, David. You know, honestly, interrupting is not an argument. The whole thing is about the people of
Neither's
Scotland,
a
the
nonsense you're
democratic right
talking.
of the people of Scotland to make their decision. Oh, dearie me. The people
Well,
of
they made
Scotland
it.
should have
They
the
made-
right
they
to make
voted
their
to stay in the
decision.
UK.
I can understand why, David. I can understand
They
why
voted to stay
UKIP
in the UK.
And then since
You
then,
don't
we've had
understand
two
democracy,
elections,
so
two
you're
general
against
elections,
it.
one in Westminster, one in Scotland.
James, finish your point. David, please give the man 20
could we
seconds.
put a muzzle on that? Yes. Please. It's a democratic decision. With 2 elections since then, it's a decision for the people of Scotland to make. And the arguments that David Coburn makes highlights why they have got no parliamentary representation anywhere in the UK except for in the European Parliament, the one that they're so desperate to close down.
We are out of time, gentlemen. It's been a pleasure talking to you. David Coburn, James Dornan, and of course earlier Robert Halls and Richard Whitman.
It's John.
Big day for the UK. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much.
We must build a kind of United States of Europe.
The King's speech introducing the new session laid emphasis on the difficulties now facing Great Britain in the international sphere.
It's been a historic day for the United Kingdom and the European Union. What will the next 2 years bring? Theresa May admits the task ahead is momentous as the UK casts off into uncharted waters. How will negotiations unfold? Will the UK be better off outside the bloc? We'll have to wait and see. And we'll be here to dissect every development. That's all for this special Brexit edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.